So the next session is on work and workers in Bengaluru. And we have Carol Upadhya, who's a professor at NIAS, the National Institute of Advanced Studies, who'll begin. She'll talk for around 15 minutes on her work, and then Ekta will take over. And then we can have a discussion after that. Carol, are you ready? Thank you.
Okay, so thanks to the organizers for inviting me. The remit that we were given was that this is a very broad panel talking about work and workers in Bangalore. And I think the reason why they thought of having this is because Bangalore is, of course, known as an IT city. And when we think about work, we think about software professionals and maybe call center workers. But there's obviously a lot of other kinds of work and workers that inhabit the city, and so that's what this panel is supposed to be about. So what I'm going to be doing actually is speaking from, just sharing some of the findings from a research project that we carried out recently at NIAS, and this was done in collaboration with a colleague of mine at ISEC, Supriya Roy Chowdhury, who couldn't be here today. Basically the project was about looking at a whole a segment of workers in the city who are not the kind of high-end professionals, highly educated IT people and corporate employees and so on, and who are not the very large segment of informal sector workers, construction workers, who I think Ekta will be talking about in that segment, but in a kind of in-between segment, which is people who are employed in what's called the new service economy. And by new service economy, what we mean is a whole range of services and jobs in things like hospitality, transportation, back office work, and retail, and so on, where increasingly jobs have gone into what's known as the organized sector, in the sense that the employment is by large companies, large stores, and so on. And so services that were earlier mostly being provided through the informal economy are now much more kind of corporatized and into the so-called organized sector. So there's a huge number of jobs that have been created in this economy. If you think about, your Uber drivers and your, Swiggy delivery guys and beauty parlors and all the workers who stand around the floor in Shoppers Stop when you go in there, I'm talking about this segment of the workforce. And this is something, why we were interested in looking at them is because it's a fairly recent kind of phenomenon in Bangalore. We've had over the last 2 decades the kind of expansion in consumption, with the growth of the middle class, with the very rapid growth of the city, and the emergence of what's called a new middle class, and new kinds of consumption practices and demand for new kinds of services and products. So we've seen the growth of this economy, this service economy, which in turn has given rise to demand for new kinds of workers. What sets them apart from these other 2 segments that I spoke about is that for the kind of jobs I'm talking about, you normally the minimum standard education that you need is 10th. It could be 10th or 12th. So it's not jobs that require a graduation or a postgraduate degree, and it's not very low-end jobs where very often workers are uneducated or they have less than 8th class education, like, so for example, in the construction industry. So it's a kind of in-between class, and we were interested in exploring, like, who are these workers? Where do they come from? What kinds of experiences of work do they have? What kind of experiences do they have in the city? Because many of them are migrants from outside of Bangalore. Thank you, sorry. My throat is... And the larger context in which this study is kind of framed is the fact that there has been this overall shift, as many of you would know, in terms of the Indian economy in general, a shift away from manufacturing and towards services. So the growth, the tertiary sector now actually provides like 55% of GDP. And in Bangalore also, the biggest share of employment is in services. So we've seen a very major change in the city, from a city that up to the 70s or so was actually a manufacturing-based city now to a very much service-based city, which means that therefore the kinds of employment, the kinds of jobs which are available has also changed. So the biggest segment of employment is in services, and I would say next to construction work, which we're going to hear more about. Construction workers are, I think, the biggest segment if you want to break down the workforce that way. So what we did in order to try to, I mean, obviously for a study, I'm an academic, so for a study like this, we try to actually have a methodological approach that will help us to, generate some kinds of verifiable data on what we're looking at, which is not easy in a sector like this because there's really no data available. Like you can't just go to the census or other sources and then pick up data which will tell you like how many workers are there in IT industry, how many workers are working in retail, et cetera. And we didn't want to do a big survey, so what we basically did was we used training centers as a kind of site with which to begin the research. Because we had found that there are a lot of these skill training centers in Bangalore that actually are engaged in identifying young people who are young people who are able to get into these kinds of jobs because they have at least 10th standard education. So they bring them to Bangalore very often from outside and give them training of, say, around 2 to 3 months, and then put them into the workforce. So we kind of located our study in training centers to try to find out what is happening there, and also to construct a cohort of young people that we could actually follow through the whole process of recruitment and into the workforce. So I have here a story of one particular young person, but I'm going to skip it. Maybe I can come back to him later. I will just share with you some of the key findings that we had from the study. I should say, first of all, that the skill training centers that we worked with all of them were NGOs, and so part of the study was about looking at the whole Skill India policy, like whether it's working or not, because these are organizations that tap into government funding or sometimes CSR corporate funding in order to run these training programs. And their agenda is to basically help young people come out of poverty by giving them some training in them and putting them into so-called organized sector jobs. And these jobs are almost entirely in a city like Bangalore or in other big cities, right? And so that they kind of operate on this philosophy that if you don't get people out of the villages and out of their kind of home situations and bring them to the city, they're never going to be able to come up. So we were very interested in looking at the intersections between this new kind of service economy, what kinds of new pathways of migration have been created by the growth of the service sector in Bangalore, and then who are the people who are coming into it as workers, how do they come here, and what happens to them afterwards. So just 2 or 3 things about kind of key findings from the study. One thing that we found was that I think one of the most important set of findings was about the nature of work. It's very interesting that, in fact, when I started to look in the literature to find out, like, what do we know about retail industry? What do we know about, say, platform economies? There's very little academic work that's actually been done on these sectors. So we don't know much about them, either in terms of the nature of the employment and the jobs themselves, or the nature of the workforce. So one thing that we found that I think other people have actually written about is that even though these jobs are theoretically located within organized sector, quote unquote, that is, it's big companies like Uber or big stores like Shoppers Stop, et cetera. In fact, the nature of the work is highly informalized. It's not like a regular corporate job or what we imagine to be a corporate job where you get a kind of a contract, you have benefits, you have some level of job security, et cetera. Many of the workers that we interviewed actually didn't even have an offer letter or a contract. They were not getting the kind of normal benefits that you're supposed to get, and so on. So what we see here is a kind of precaritization or informalization of labor within the corporate economy. This is something that people have also talked about in other contexts when they looked at the kind of the contractualization of labor in corporate organizations earlier. But here what we have are people who are actually being hired directly by the companies, and yet they're not really forming a kind of a regular or permanent workforce. And so on top of that, the jobs are actually quite dead end in the sense that for entry-level workers like this, these are young people, 18, 20 years old, who have, as I said, maybe up to 12 standard education, some of them even college education, but who come from outside the city, come from what we were just talking about, very often coming from North Karnataka, from Hyderabad, Karnataka, from the most kind of so-called backwards and poverty-stricken regions of the country, which is where these organizations actually try to source workers because they say these people are more in need, they are really desperate for jobs, and so we can bring them to the city. You have this kind of migration flow coming into these jobs, but the jobs themselves are not offering them actually any kind of a pathway to secure employment or to any kind of a career path, precisely because if you look at, for example, the big retail shops, they have a huge kind of a labor pool available to them of potential workers. So if workers leave, they can almost immediately hire and put them on the floor without any kind of training, because these jobs don't require much of training. They require a kind of basic, education and a little smattering of English, which is what these skill training centers mostly impart. And so when these workers actually come and get into the job, they realize that actually they don't have a future. They always say to us, there's no future here, because they're never going to move up into a kind of a team lead or a management role. So then what do? Basically what they do, if you go to any mall and start talking to workers, they within 3 to 6 months, once they're in a job, they will be out to the next job. They're all the time churning. Why are they churning? Because they're looking for another 500 rupees in terms of pay. They're looking for slightly more decent working conditions or whatever it is. So it's a highly unstable workforce in which attrition is kind of the order of the day, and from both the perspective of the worker as well as the organization, one could say that it kind of serves a purpose in the sense that because workers know that they're not going to have a career there, they're not going to really get any kind of pathway to social mobility through these jobs, they keep on looking out for another option. And from what I could see, if I look particularly at the organized retail sector, this also benefits the companies because they don't have to invest in training workers, they don't have to invest in trying to stabilize their workforce, which reminds me very much of how BPOs used to operate, by the way. So basically, because of these kind of conditions, what we see is this kind of very unstable, very mobile kind of a workforce where people are all the time moving in and out of different types of jobs, in and out, moving from place to place, moving from company to company, looking for something slightly better. And so you have what we have seen in the city being created is what I'm calling a peripatetic workforce. That there's this huge kind of cohort of footloose labor who are moving between jobs like retail, hospitality, working in cafe, coffee day, then going to one of the retail shops, coming out, maybe trying to be a driver for some time. There's this kind of churning that happens all the time. Which means that basically the so-called new service economy, organized services, is not really providing a pathway towards any type of economic upward mobility for these young people. So then what happens to these workers who come out from outside Bangalore? What we found, it was actually a rather shocking kind of a finding that we had from these 3 skill training centers, where we basically followed a cohort of trainees, from the recruitment process into training and then into the workforce. And then our plan was to follow up every 3 months or so with phone calls and find out what's happened to them once they got into the job. After 3 months, we couldn't find anybody, almost nobody. They had all left the job. So we had phone numbers. Phone number doesn't work anymore. And through some network, through some friends, we would try to track them and find out what happened to them. Many of them had gone back to their villages or their hometowns. They were doing something else, or they just changed jobs. Or, so what we could kind of reconstruct from these kind of 2-year life histories of these young people was that that basically there is this kind of very hypermobility which goes on, where they might come from the village to Bangalore for a few months, work, make some money, then go back home, maybe help out on the farm for a while, do something else. And so there's this kind of mobility and complete instability in terms of building a kind of a career or even a kind of steady employment or set of skills that make you employable. And that entire picture is completely in contradiction to what the Skill India program and policy basically imagines, which is that if you just give young people skills, then somehow there are jobs out there which are going to give them like a stable life, which is not what we found at all. So one part of it is this kind of both spatial and spatial mobility combined with this kind of instability in terms of work. Another thing that we found really very interesting in terms of the interviews and these kind of long interviews we did with the workers is that even though they found these service sector jobs to be, very unaspirational for them, they had, this is not something which they ever imagined they would want to do, is, be driving an Uber in the city or, working in a big retail shop. But they did see it as often as a kind of a stepping stone where they could kind of acquire some basic skills, improve their English, maybe save a little money. And very often what they were doing was investing in a longer term plan, which had to do with kind of basically going through periods of self-cultivation where they would work for a while and then they would go back and maybe do another training course, do a kind of a coaching class. And as you know, the basic ambition for most young people at this level in terms of education is to get a government job. This is what they imagined would actually give them a stable future. And so all the time they're investing in kind of coaching and sitting, doing kinds of, self-education programs so that they could sit for the police entrance exam, sit for the army exam, and these kinds of things. Now, obviously, given the job situation, very few of them were ever actually going to be able to accomplish that goal. And I think in some sense they realized that. But what I would like to interpret these narratives as is not to say that, okay, these people are overambitious, they don't understand their own limitations, they should be more practical and just, stick with whatever job they get. What I feel is that it tells us that, these young people who we think of as unemployable actually have very clear ideas of what a good future looks like, what it should look like. And in a sense, their narrative constitute a critique of this kind of very precarious, informalized urban job situation which they're facing, where employers and government both think that they should just be happy if they get a job, earning 10,000 rupees a month. But in fact, what they are looking out for is something much more kind of giving them some type of stability, some kind of a better income and life than what their parents had. I think I'm probably running out of time. So let me see if I have any other point. Yeah, so basically what we are looking at is a very kind of complicated life histories, and what it tells us, as a kind of micro level study, what it tells us about the larger scenario in terms of unemployment, in terms of aspirations of the youth, and also in terms of what India has been doing in terms of, Indian government, I should say, has been doing in terms of the whole question of skilling and education for young people and planning for the future in terms of employment. There's one last point I just wanted to bring up, and I'll leave it there, is that we're looking at the intersections between this kind of changing economic and employment structure with the rise of the service economy and the changing kind of face of the city itself. The one factor that led many of these young people to go back to their villages because they couldn't hack it in the city was the problem of housing. Housing is extremely expensive in Bangalore, and of course they would be renting spaces, they would be staying in PGs, sharing rooms with 3-4 people, et cetera. Even then, on a salary of 8,000 or 10,000, many of them could not manage because they were here in the city to save some money to send back home, right? So if all of their salary was getting eaten up with commuting, with rent, and with food, then it wasn't worth it to them. And so there's another whole aspect of this is where, the kind of larger picture is that you have this city where, for the upper middle classes, for the middle classes and the affluent classes, there's this kind of over-proliferation of housing, of high-end housing, as we know that there's this huge amount of housing stock which is empty and unsold. And at the other end, there is not sufficient housing to maintain the workforce that actually make the whole city run, either for construction workers who, live in informal settlements, or for these kind of mid-level workers who, require some kind of more decent housing. So that's a kind of larger picture in terms of, the issue of work in the city. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this. I still feel I'm scratching the surface. I say that because I started off my work with as a consequence of a protest, a failed protest, where we were trying to protect trees in Bangalore, and the metro was coming up at the time. And we felt that that we couldn't fight the system, so maybe we should go talk to the workers and understand what Bangalore really means. And that led me and my friend to make 3 films. But since then, I've still kind of been in touch with the workers, and today it's probably the 12th year that I'm in touch with a few workers who are still in Bangalore. So I'm talking of a phenomenon of migrant workers who came to build the metro in Bangalore, who are no longer new migrants to the city. They've been here now for 10 years, 11 years. They want to find home here. They don't want to return to the village. They probably appear as if they are, for their families, they've probably disappeared because they're not returning home. Many people think they're missing, and I feel I've met them. So it's kind of this odd situation where as the influx of workers are increasing, as there's a lot of acceleration on building the metro in as many parts of the city, get the city connected, fix the roads, infrastructure, and things like that, I think a kind of a very surreal story goes on in the lives of migrant workers in Bangalore. And I just thought I'll just share maybe a few aspects of things which haven't changed actually in the last 10 years. Of course, it's contract labor. Most of them come from northern parts of the country. There's no local labor employed in the metro, and there's absolutely no unionization that's been possible. So the question can be asked why, because clearly there have been a few workers who've been in Bangalore for so many years now, and we still find that it is difficult to unionize them because, firstly, the idea of the union itself is not in sync with what the workers really need. So, for example, just yesterday I was talking to a very close friend of mine who was very angry and called me up and said, I'm going to set the metro on fire. And he's like, hathiyar uthane ka time aa gaya hai abhi. So it basically means that the anger and rage that's growing, I think, inside the working class, I would say, is actually something that is of serious concern. And I think we can't really escape it for too long. Parts of the things have already started breaking out in labor colonies between different communities, whether it's a Bihari worker from Bihar versus, say, a worker from Punjab. There has already been those kinds of fights breaking out, but I feel that it has reached that point where I think there are some people who still feel like we don't want to be working here like donkeys. We don't know why we are building this metro, and we have a lot of power in our hands as well. So does it come to me as a threat? Not really. It's just something that I feel that we haven't actually addressed in terms of, and one has to understand why it has reached this kind of. It's a very thin line where things may just snap. Either there'll be lots of worker suicides, or there is just going to be some kind of damage that I keep dreaming of, and hopefully that will reflect in my next film. But I seriously feel that even if none of these dramatic events take place, it is the preoccupation in many of the workers that I've consistently met over the last 11 years. One of the big problems is that they don't migrate with their families. And I think that living, like if there were 1,000 men living in, a very congested space, a transient labor colony, what exactly goes on inside this person's mind and life, right? And most of the times, these are givens, like bad working conditions, no water, unpaid overtime. This is a constant thing. Absolutely no access to union, no health services. And the thing that we've been kind of trying to focus on within our project is try to also cater or think about what goes on in while he's working, or while he's just while he takes a break. So what we found is that many of the workers felt there's a deep sense of loneliness and a deep sense of alienation, and this huge kind of conflict and tension between the local and the migrant, which I think has already started to come out in many different ways in the city, whether it is a judgment made on the way a woman dresses versus how a man, it's quite dangerous to go into these kind of areas because, you know, there are very many strange people in these areas. There's no lighting. So I feel that the conversation keeps getting distracted into many other things. But somewhere I think we're kind of almost not interested in looking at the causes of these forms of violence, whether it is sexual harassment, whether in some cases it's rape, whether in some cases it's a kind of, there are various suicides that are not recorded, various missing complaints persons, which again seem to not have, they don't seem to ever feature in our newspapers. So I think with the migrant worker, like I was again talking to another friend yesterday who was telling me that in Kerala, the policy is quite different, right? Even though there are many parts of Kerala which have migrant workers, they are encouraged to travel and migrate with their families. So they live with their families and they have their children there. But at the same time, the role of the state is so powerful that he's able to actually then tell. They're also learning Malayalam, but they also have access to a Oriya school or a Hindi-speaking school. So there's a way in which I think there is a way in which the role of the state is quite different from that which I think in the way it operates in Karnataka, because there is a sense of understanding that it is not going to work out in the long run to have workers coming from different parts of the country actually building the entire city and not having a sense of belonging. And I think to pay attention to that is something that maybe we have to probably start thinking. In my opinion, it's already too late. So the other thing that simultaneously started to happen, I also work in a media and arts collective called Mara, and we felt that the representation of labor in mainstream media is absolutely it's absent, or it kind of is very frivolous, or it discounts the value of a worker in the city by just reducing him to a number, by just reducing him into just some kind of this worker died on this day and that's it. And even if you read the manual scavenging reports, or you read reports about a garment worker getting harassed, or if you read about a construction worker dying on the site, the kind of writing around it really disturbed us, and we felt it was necessary to probably look at how we can draw the attention of the city to think about considering a labor beat, let's say, in a mainstream newspaper, a space where labor should actually be one of the most important things to be discussed when we think of imagination of cities and infrastructure and development and beautification and all of that. Because technically the city is built and cleaned, and most of the things are done by workers. So we decided to work with the unorganized sector workers in Bangalore, and so we ended up working with, we started talking to various unions, and we also tried to focus on many women workers, because most of the unorganized sector workers we also found are women. So whether it is the Paura Karmikas, the domestic workers, or the sex workers, of course garment workers would come in the organized sector, but we thought it would be interesting to try and have conversations that can work between these women, and further try and see how they could come together to address different sets of questions to an audience that probably hasn't thought about this. So the whole idea was to try and see if we could try and bring out some of the stories that often get left out from, I guess, discourse, mainstream discourse. And in a way, we also wanted to challenge the status quo in terms of how stories and reports about workers are written. So the result of that is a bi-monthly newspaper that we'll give you a copy of. It's called Bengaluru, and this is something that we've been working on for the last 1 year with the support of IFA grant, which is just supports, I guess, artists and collectives to go deeper into a particular research process and then develop work and put it back in the public realm. So these newspapers, we bring it out once in 2 months, and it's in 3 languages, because we also acknowledge that maybe 50 to 60%, nobody's done any, I don't think I would trust any research study on how many migrant workers are there in the city. I think it's a significant number. And having said that, I'm not speaking only about the IT workers, and I'm speaking about various workers who are also within the unorganized sector, who are actually migrant workers. So the people who are working in darshanis, as you would have noticed, are now mostly from the northeast and also from Bihar and Jharkhand. And so it's quite funny to think about language and how that has played out totally different. It's a different relationship with language, food, and other things. I won't go into that, but this newspaper is dedicated to really kind of not just look at the worker as the victim, which is also something we were trying to do in our work. And why do we say that? Of course, many times when we speak to the domestic workers or the Paura Karmikas, the first thing that they have to say is how they probably they've been exploited, or they're discriminated, or they were violated, or something terrible happened. So how do you write about that experience, and how do we represent that story in the context of in relation to what is going on within the city? Because who is to take the responsibility for these forms of violence? Because clearly the middle class is very comfortable in maintaining a kind of this kind of benevolent attitude of I do this at least for them. But this at least and this well-intentioned attitude of I think the middle class has to really shift, because casteism is practiced across, and even though people keep saying it's invisible, I think it is like right in the face of people, and that's one. The second is also economics. Like people just don't want to increase salaries no matter what. Even if it's 50 rupees, it's actually something that a worker has to beg for almost a year. More than that, there's also moments of, it's just little things. It's like, why did you, to use a bathroom becomes a very, it's funny that we think that workers operate like machines. Even today, Paura Karmikas don't have toilets. So exactly how is a person supposed to function from 6 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon without a bathroom? So essentially, this newspaper is representative of various different experiences, their worldviews and aspirations, and we hope that at someday that they would actually be able to take this up and write for it by themselves, and we just do the logistical work. That seems like it's going to take us a long time, but the whole idea is to have such a discourse central to the idea of what we think or what we call as a city. Thank you.